should have tested Fruity Cheerios. So I hope you were able to make lots of interesting observations when you were watching the Cheerios effect. I know I made several when I was having my breakfast. So some of the questions that came up while I was eating and watching those last few Cheerios float around was, what if I used a different cereal? What if I ran out of milk and I used orange juice? Gross, I know, but it's been done. Does the type of bowl matter? And I decided to create a hypothesis that I could test based on one of those questions. So I took the question, does the type of bowl matter? And I decided to create a hypothesis that sounds like this. If I put Cheerios and milk in bowls made of different materials, then I think that the number of Cheerios attracted to the edge of the bowl will change because water is attracted more strongly to certain materials. Okay, so I took my question, I restated it with the if part to give you some background, and then I made a prediction. I predicted that I would have more Cheerios stuck to the edge on some materials than others because of the attraction. And so that reasoning came from my prior knowledge. Now it's time to design an experiment to test our hypothesis. Remember, a good experiment has to test only one variable at a time. All the other variables have to stay the same. We call this holding them constant. So what are the variables in this experiment where we're testing the type of material that the bowls are going to be made out of? Well, we have the cereal, but more specifically, we have the type of cereal, we have how much cereal, and we have should we use all the pieces or only whole pieces, okay? Then we have our milk, right? The variables here would be what type of milk do we use and how much milk do we use. Lastly, we have our bowls. So our bowls could have different shapes. They could be round or square. These all have flat bottoms and they're round. What size are they? And finally, what material are they made out of? So I just gave you, that is 8 variables, right? Only one of those variables can be changed. The rest of them I have to hold constant. And that one variable I'm going to change is the material that the bowls are made out of. So how did I hold everything else constant? Well, I tried to find bowls that were the same size and the same shape. And I'm going to use the same jug of milk for each trial. And I'm going to measure it out. That will allow me to keep the type and the amount constant. And then I've counted out 30 Cheerios to add to each bowl. So the amount of Cheerios is constant. It came from the same box. And I took out all of the little broken Cheerios. So all of these will be whole Cheerios. Okay, so now we've kept all of those variables constant except for the one that we're going to test, the materials. All right, let's test it. The next part of our data analysis is to create a graph of our data so that we can quickly interpret our data and draw conclusions from it. In order to create a graph, and I've asked you guys to create a bar graph, we have to know what the independent and the dependent variables are. The independent variable always goes on the bottom, and this might be a new word for you, but it is just another way to say the experimental variable. If you remember on the video when we were listing all of the variables that we were working with in this experiment, the experimental variable, the type of bowl, was all by itself. All the other variables we were holding constant. Because it's all by itself, we can only test one thing at a time. We call it independent. All right, over here, this is our dependent variable. This is not a variable that we were manipulating, but it is the result of our experiment. The next part to this graph is to take a look at our data, because we need to put some numbers on our axes, right? We need to know the average number of Cheerios. So here we have 7, and the average of 7, 8, and 11 is going to be somewhere between 7 and 11. So I think it's safe to just number this axis from 0 to 10. All right, so now we have a numbered y-axis, and down here, a bar graph, we're going to state what the types were that we used. So this will be metal, glass, and plastic. Lastly, because we're doing the metal one together, we need to create a bar for this bar graph. So since we had 7 Cheerios stuck to the side, we'll create a bar that goes up to the number 7. And that's all there is to it. When you have your average values for your glass and plastic, you'll be able to finish up your bar graph. All right, guys, we're at the end. It's time to write the conclusion. Remember, a conclusion has to be written in complete sentences, so make sure that you are doing all the punctuation things. Also, make sure that you answer the question that this experiment was based off of. Did the different types of bowls attract different numbers of Cheerios to their sides? And when you tell the answer to that question, make sure that you give some evidence in the form of data from your experiment. All right, if you can think of a next step, something that might have been wrong with the experiment, or a different way to test it, it'd be good to include that in your conclusion as well.